A Maryland man was almost among those innocent victims until he became the first American on death row to be exonerated by DNA evidence. And this is how Kirk Bloodsworth, seen here in the blue shirt reaching for the sky, reacted to the Maryland House vote to repeal the death penalty. Yes, folks, that is how you react when you've worked this hard to get rid of the death penalty in your state that once almost took your own life. Joining me now are Congressman Barbara Lee of California, a state which still has legal death penalty, NYU constitutional law professor Kenji Yoshino, Barry Scheck, who is co-director of the Innocence Project, and the man in that fabulous photo that we have been loving in Nerdland, Kirk Bloodsworth, now an advocacy director at Witness to Innocence. And so, Kirk, I want to start with you on this. Tell me a little bit about how your story has turned into your work.
Well, it's in 1984, I was accused of a brutal crime that happened in Baltimore County, Maryland, and to make a long story short, after 8 years, 10 months and 19 days, and 2 years on death row, thanks to people like Barry here, we submitted for DNA testing, and I was free. It took another 10 years to, from pressure from Barry and I and others, to push the state to do a DNA testing. You know, this was all based on a guy that was described as 6'5", curly blonde hair, bushy mustache, tan skin. In the end, he was only 5'6" and 160 pounds. But I had realized early on in my incarceration and this whole thing that an innocent person could be executed, and I could never support a death penalty with that happening. We have 142 exonerated death row inmates in the United States, and a lot of them are members of Witness to Innocence, the group that I'm the advocacy director for. So that moment in that photograph was lifting everybody up, and it was the most unique thing I've ever experienced.
So, Barry, I want to talk about DNA and innocence for a second, because it feels like DNA has become the kind of evidentiary basis on which we've finally been able to say, okay, really, this person did not commit this crime. And yet, even as I'm listening to Kirk tell the story, the fact is it begins in part because of a whole set of faulty other bases of evidence. DNA matters to me, but I also somehow want to be sure that we can begin to talk about sense without the one turning point that is DNA.
Well, the key point to understand is that DNA is only present in less than 10% of serious felony cases. So what about the other 95% of cases where it's based on eyewitness identification? There were 5 mistaken eyewitnesses in Kirk's case. And as Kirk said, the real assailant didn't even really look like him, and they were in the same jail cell for some period of time. It's quite incredible.
Wow.
And we have false confessions. We have the intractable problem of race. We have indigent defenders that are not adequately funded to do the job, and here we are on the 50th anniversary of Gideon, and that is a promise that's unfulfilled. We have forensic science, and I'm happy to say that finally it appears after a landmark report 4 years ago by the National Academy of Sciences that said the only forensic assay that is really validated scientifically, that is DNA testing, and they criticize quite severely fingerprints, bite marks, tool marks on bullets, all kinds of other forensic assays that just really hadn't been adequately validated, and some of them may not be validatable. We now have a national commission with National Institute of Standards and Technology and the Department of Justice, and we're going to have 30 people appointed to that starting soon. So some progress has been made, but the real significance of DNA, it's been a learning moment for the criminal justice system, and we realize how riddled with error this system is in the first place.
Yes, I mean, it feels to me like, okay, so if Kirk didn't do it and was convicted on it, then the problem isn't just missing DNA test, right? It was all of these other pieces. I also heard you say the intractable problem of race. And, you know, we can't talk about death penalty without talking about race. And I want to just make clear sort of how important that particular alchemy is. It's not so much that African Americans are more likely to get the death penalty, but it has to do with that alchemy between race of victim and race of assailant. Explain that to us for just a second.
Well, yeah. I mean, if the victim in a murder is white, you're far more likely to get capital punishment whether the defendant is black or white. So that race effect has long been in place, and there was a case that, too bad Justice Powell, when he got off the court, said, "Oh my God, I really made a bad decision in this McCleskey case. I wish I could take one back. If he had taken that one back and decided the right way, so many things would be different." But there are race effects. And what we should mention one very clear case that's now in Texas of a defendant named Dwayne Buck. And this is really quite illustrative. Nobody's saying he's innocent, but at his sentencing proceeding, there literally was expert testimony that said he would be violent. He was a risk for future danger just because he was African American. And even Senator Cornyn, when he was Attorney General, had identified 9 cases, and this Buck's was one of them, that all of them except Buck's case have been set aside and got resentencing, and Dwayne Buck should get a new hearing.
And Kenji, I want to come to you on another thing that was said here, which is it's 50 years since Gideon, and that's an unfulfilled promise. So, you know, I know in the land of constitutional law, that makes perfect sense. Everyone knows what we're talking about. Remind us again what Gideon is and why we're still unfulfilled 50 years later.
Right. So Gideon has to do with effective assistance of counsel and the guarantee that even if you're indigent, you know, no matter what, in a criminal case, you will have effective assistance of counsel. And the reason that we haven't sort of fulfilled the promise of Gideon, I mean, there are many, many ways, but one is just over the definition of what effective means, right? More broadly, though, you know, I think that if we trace the trajectory here, I mean, as we've seen an uptick in the number of states that are repealing it, I think we've also seen the Supreme Court hand down cases to the 8th Amendment, striking down various aspects of the death penalty. So we have the Atkins case and the Roper case, you know, so 2002, 2005, so not so long ago, that say that you cannot impose a death penalty on individuals who are mentally retarded. You cannot impose a death penalty on people who are underage or minors, right? And so it's really interesting to see how this is going to play out, because you can see it going either way. You can either say this is the thin end of the wedge, and ultimately this is the way the court is going to give new life to the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment and say this is violative of the Constitution. Or you can say now we've had these checks in place, we've made the death penalty more fair, and so therefore this is no longer cruel and unusual punishment. So this is something that we really have to watch very closely, and I don't think that the outcome is clear.
And it feels to me like Congresswoman Lee, that's part of the politics of it, right? So there's the law of it, but the politics of it, and you know, even as I was talking about it, it's about the issue of cost, right? If we can argue that it's too expensive to keep people on death row, it's the question of effectiveness. Is it really a deterrent? It's the question of innocence. Are we putting potentially people to death who are innocent? But there's a part of me that wants to say, okay, even if it was cost effective, and even if no one were, you know, if everyone were guilty, this is still fundamentally problematic as a policy. So what are the politics that allow us to get not just the thin end of the wedge, but the big part of the wedge through, so that we're ending the death penalty?
Let me go back to California, for example. In the late 70s, 71% of Californians supported the death penalty. In 2012, about 52% of Californians supported the death penalty. The NAACP, thank goodness, took the lead in putting forth a Proposition 34, in California on the last ballot in this last election. And it failed, but it only failed by about 48 to 52%. Again, 52% still in California support the death penalty. But I share that because it's important to recognize that people finally are beginning to wake up. They're beginning to understand that it is not cost effective. It does not increase public safety. Life in prison without possibility of parole is the most prudent, most effective punishment. Right now, Melissa, we're in the category of countries such as Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, China, a couple more. And I think this is where America wants to be. I think we have a better way to approach penalties. No one is saying that criminals and people who commit murder should not be punished, but we're saying that we have to do this in a way that makes sense.
And that's exactly where I want us to pick up when we come back, because I think it's the innocence piece is a critical part of it, but I also do want to talk about the point you just made. Even if there's guilt and we're sure of it, should we be talking about the death penalty when we're next?